Welcome to the 10-Minute Bible Hour podcast. Right now, we're going through the entire Bible to understand it as one big, cohesive story. We're covering one book each day, and this one's about Genesis.
Hey, my friends, it's Matt. This is the 10-Minute Bible Hour podcast, and I'm excited because we're starting a new series today where we're going through the entire Bible, one book per day until we're done. And we're doing them in order, which means we got Genesis first. It's the origin story for the whole narrative of the Bible. It's the origin story for humanity, existence, the human problem, death, government, Israel, God's redemptive plan. And it is high drama from beginning to end. There's not really one human character, though, for you to latch on to. You figure out really quickly that the main character of Genesis is the first character to be mentioned, which is in Genesis 1:1. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. That's your main character. Also, Genesis is just a straight-up long book. It's got 50 chapters, but the chapters, of course, they're added after the fact. If you really want to know which books of the Bible are the longest, you got to look at the original Hebrew word count. And it looks like Genesis, I did not know this, it surprised me, comes up second in the whole Bible behind only Jeremiah. Who knew? But Genesis is also a super long book in that it covers a massive time frame that is shockingly huge compared to anything else in the Bible. The time covered in Genesis is greater, not just than all the rest of the time covered by the rest of the Bible combined. It's greater than the time covered from the end of Genesis till right now, as you and I are having this conversation. In fact, let's just say that Genesis ends around 1800 BC. That's what it looks like. It looks like it wraps up about 4,000 years ago. Well, when does it start? You can't put a date on it. It starts in infinity. That's what it holds itself out as doing, because it begins with only God on screen before existence even exists. So this, in my mind, is the biggest proposition in terms of what we need to cover in one episode of anything we're going to see in this whole series. So I might just give myself a couple extra minutes on this one. Genesis is written by Moses. Both Christian and Jewish tradition says that. The first 5 books of the Old Testament, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. Christians call it the Pentateuch and Jews call it the Torah. Within these 5 books, there are internal indications. Explicitly, this is like Moses wrote this part. But also, to be fair, Moses dies in one of these books. So clearly Moses didn't write the part about then he died and got buried. And it's also worth noting that in the book of John, I think chapter 5, Jesus affirms that Moses is the author of Genesis. But I don't think the Bible is making any secret at all about what kind of processes had to go into this, because the whole timeline of the Bible is in the Bible. So it acknowledges that Moses is writing this way after the fact, like hundreds of years, 400 years, maybe 600 years after the end of Genesis is when Moses was latching on to the written records that he was using here, the source documents that he was drawing from, and the oral traditions that have been passed down. Bottom line, Christians believe that the entire process that went into writing Genesis, sources and using genres that maybe we don't even remember anymore or fully know the dance steps of, all of that, Christians believe is superintended by God to communicate exactly what he wanted to communicate to that original audience and to people like you and me who would read it after the fact. Okay, there's that. Now let's talk about what's actually going on in the book. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. We're talking about a paradigm here that is completely different than the paradigm in which you and I live in Genesis 1:1. There aren't things yet. The markers that we use to orient ourselves in space and in time physically, they're not there. There aren't people yet. There isn't history yet. God exists, but I'm not sure where, and I'm not even sure asking where is the right question. God is eternal. He has no beginning. That's how he's held out as being. It's what logic dictates as well. And the opening scene here has us in that environment. And God thinks about how he wants things to be. And he's like, you know what? I'd like for there to be existence instead of non-existence. And so he uses his mind and his unbelievable power to conjure existence out of non-existence and to move that from a state of chaos and darkness to a state of order and light, reflective of his character. So we get all of that in the creation account, and then we run into the crown jewel of what he made, and a second paradigm that is very different from the one in which you and I live, and that is the paradigm of the garden, Adam and Eve. The man and woman live in this paradise with God, and they hang out, apparently. They have unbroken fellowship, and Adam and Eve, made in the image of God, are commissioned to go be creative and take the raw materials that God has made. They can't make raw materials out of nothing like God can, but they can take what he has made and make beautiful things out of it, and that's what they're told to do. What an amazing commissioning. But then some stupid jerk snake comes along, and he's just a shady character. We don't really know a ton about him other than he doesn't like God, and he doesn't like the garden thing. He doesn't like God's plan. Apparently, he doesn't like the people, and so he's just mad about everything. But he's duplicitous and deceptive and dirty, and a lot of the characters later on in Genesis act a lot like him, unfortunately. And somehow he tricks Adam and Eve into eating fruit they're not supposed to eat from a specific tree. If you eat the fruit from it, you get knowledge that humans are just too clumsy to wield. It's too sharp an instrument for their level of knowledge and character and power and ability, but God can wield it. It's the knowledge of good and evil. Well, they get that knowledge, and sure enough, they can't handle it. They don't know what to do with it. It introduces a whole bunch of problems to the equation: pain, suffering, war, death, toil, labor over childbirth, separation from God, and in general, it creates, I guess, what we would call the human problem. And that brings us to the inflection point of the whole story. Imperfection has been introduced to the system. Is God going to look at that and be like, I'm done, I'll just make another one some other time? Or is God going to look at that and say, I'm going to redeem it? Well, remember, this God is held out as being unlimited and knowing all things. So I guess there's not much of a surprise at all that he knew this was coming, and he's already decided he's going to create a redemptive plan and make it better. Now, that plan does not immediately come into crystal clear focus. In fact, in the book of Genesis, we just get some hints here and there that might not make sense if it weren't for the benefit of the ensuing books and then Jesus and the whole thing that it gets to. But they're still there. And the first hint comes when God is telling off this snake and pronouncing curses on him for what he's done here in Genesis chapter 3. He says, "Cursed are you above all the livestock and all the wild animals. You'll crawl on your belly and you'll eat dust all the days of your life. And I will put enmity between you and the woman and between your offspring and hers. He will crush your head and you will strike his heel." Now, that might just sound like some old mythic origin story about how the snake became such a pain in the butt for people in the world. But in light of everything else we see in the Bible, no, that's the first glimmer of hope. He's saying that Adam and Eve, eventually they're going to have some offspring, however far down the road, who's going to take a hit from that serpent, but the woman's offspring is going to crush his head, and in doing so, defeat sin and evil and the curse and everything that's gone wrong here. Well, then for about the next 8 chapters, we remain in this super distant ancient history, again, with genres and sources that we might not totally understand, but the stories still make the point. In this age, which a lot of fancy Bible people call the primeval age of the Bible, I think that's a primeval, it's a great word. But back in this very, very distant old age, the stories all point to the same thing. Humanity's wrecked. This isn't something that just went wrong once, but other people are better behaved and it's going to work out if you just give it a little bit of time. No, if you give it more time apart from God, it's going to get worse. And maybe somebody would be reading through that and think to themselves, well, just lock up the bad people, overthrow the government, and then put the good people in charge and it will get better. Well, we get a test case for that. God gets fed up. He floods the world and he effectively resets things partway with sort of a new Adam and a new Eve. Noah survives the flood with his family, so maybe you're thinking like, oh, well, now we're in a new garden and things are going to work out, but it doesn't work out. And very shortly after getting off of that boat, he finds himself liquored up, passed out naked in a tent, and then one of his sons goes in there and there's some kind of bizarre incident that occurs. I don't understand the anatomy of exactly what went on there other than to say the original audience was meant to guffaw in horror at how absolutely depraved that was and say, yeah, never mind. There's just no setting it straight. You could reset it 100 times. The flood's just like that. But the disease isn't just institutional. It's in the heart of man. Something is on us. We can't help ourselves. If this curse is to be beaten, it's going to have to be beaten by God. Enter chapter 12. Enter Abram. The rest of the book of Genesis is going to track the story of this guy and his family. God picks him out of the clear blue sky. Is like, you right there. Not because you're particularly great or special or good, but because I picked you. I'm making an unconditional deal with you. You have to do nothing. I am going to do the following. I'm going to make you a great name. I'm going to make you a great nation with a ton of descendants. I'm going to give you a promised land, and through you, all the nations will be blessed. Abram, who becomes Abraham, gets a lot of stuff right, gets a ton of stuff wrong. But the one thing that is credited to him as righteousness is that he believes God. Usually. Sometimes he doesn't. Sometimes he goes to places that are dominated by warlords or kings he's afraid of. And even though he's met and talked to God and trusts God, he doesn't trust him quite enough to think that those kings and warlords won't do bad things to him. So he holds out his wife as being his sister in the hope that these authority figures will welcome her into their harem and do whatever they do, and that somehow that will keep Abraham safe. And he comes off looking like an idiot. At the same time, he's got moments of great trust and faith in God. Bottom line, he's a mixed bag, and so are his descendants. He has a kid named Isaac when both he and Sarah are very old, and Isaac is a mixed bag. Isaac has two kids we'll talk about briefly, Esau and Jacob. Esau is set to inherit this promise to Abraham through his line and his descendants, but Jacob weasels in, imitating a lot of the tricks that the serpent used, and he steals Esau's inheritance and then runs off and flees out to the desert where he meets a guy named Laban. Then Laban uses serpent-like tricks on Jacob to steal years of labor from Jacob. Then Jacob starts tricking Laban back. And even when these people tell each other the truth, it's always a monkey paw style promise. Eventually, things get so tense with Laban, with all the lying and tricking back and forth, that Jacob has to take his 4 wives and his kids and go back to Esau and hope Esau will treat him well. And this scene is like a drink of cool water in the desert. Esau acts like God instead of acting like the serpent. Jacob's got this whole thing rehearsed like, oh, I'm so sorry, I'm not worthy to be. And Esau just embraces him and receives him back as his brother. It's absolutely beautiful. And I think it's echoed in the parable of the prodigal son in Luke chapter 15. Well, Jacob, whose name eventually gets changed to Israel, has 12 sons. One of them is Joseph. Joseph is Jacob/Israel's favorite, and the brothers don't like it. One brother, Judah, is like, you know what? Let's push him into a pit and sell him to slavers in Egypt. And so he does. And Joseph ends up in a prison in Egypt, but then by the providence of God, he's lifted up to becoming the right-hand man of Pharaoh, and God enables Joseph to anticipate a big famine and to prepare for it. And then what happens? Those other 11 brothers, they have to go to Egypt to get help, and without knowing it, they crawl right back to Joseph, who acts like Esau and receives them and forgives them, and they go back and they get Jacob, and everybody moves to Egypt, and they all have enough food. And right at the end of Genesis, Jacob is giving his blessing to all of his sons, and you would assume, and the promise of this blessing and this one who is to come, you would think that's going to come through the line of Joseph, but it doesn't. For whatever reason, Jacob gives it to Judah. He says in verse 49, the scepter will not depart from Judah, nor the ruler's staff from between his feet, until he comes to whom it belongs, and the obedience of the nations is his. Judah doesn't have a lot of good screen time in Genesis. Go read chapter 38 and do not bring the kids. He is stunningly dumb and bad more often than not, and yet by him receiving this blessing and receiving the lineage that would eventually point to the one who will crush the serpent, and in doing so crush the curse, what we're getting is a reiteration of the theme throughout Genesis, that even when Abraham and his family are unfaithful, God is still faithful to see through this redemptive plan. He is going to redeem the mess. He is going to defeat the curse, and he's going to do it because of his character and in spite of human resistance, even at times in spite of the people who claim to follow him. So look at that. We got a bona fide plot. We have a clear sense of the genesis of God's creation, as well as the genesis of the human problem, and the genesis of God's redemptive plan through the genesis of a new people that he is creating from scratch out of this guy named Abraham and his descendants. Okay, big picture. When we imagine Genesis, let's envision the Garden of Eden, the creation and the fall. Let's envision Noah's Ark. Let's envision Abraham, and let's envision his descendants, particularly all of them in Egypt with Joseph. If we picture those visuals, it'll make it easy to remember the main point of Genesis, which is the introduction of the problem. That is, creation fell, humans are broken, and the promise of the solution to the problem, which is going to come through the line of Abraham. If you don't have time to go and read all of Genesis, make sure you at least check out Genesis 12, 1 through 3. That'll help you remember the gist. All right, Genesis achievement unlocked. Nice job. One book down. Tomorrow we're going to unlock another achievement with Exodus. All right, I'm Matt. This is the 10-Minute Bible Hour podcast. Let's do this again soon.